What I remember most, you should remember, while I remember, that it was 35 years ago. And there's some jokes about that's older than ties in my wardrobe, you know. But it's a long time. It's more than a generation ago. And so, like some Japanese painting where the tips of the mountain peek out of the mist, so the mist of forgetfulness and experience that postcedes all of that happened to me during Star Trek gets in the way of my memory of it. And so they're just highlights of memory that that come to me. So when you ask me, what is my impression of Star Trek now? The word you just used, the word I'd like to use, is exuberance.
What are we running here? A cadet ship number 1? Are we ready or not?
All decks are ready, sir.
Engage.
The first pilot was lavish and well-produced and well-directed. A very interesting idea, but couldn't be sold because it did not have a central dramatic line that you could follow easily where you knew who you were rooting for. It wasn't that kind of a story. It was a story that had to do with a guy who's taken away by these aliens in order to try to get him to procreate with this lady. And they're showing him all these different kinds of sexual fantasies to try to get him aroused, to try to turn him on. And it was a very interesting idea from a Freudian and Jungian point of view, but it was not typical television by any means. The network just didn't get it. And so it didn't work, but they decided to try again.
You want some coffee, dear?
Westerns were big, and I wanted to sell it, and I said, look, fellas, it's little more than a Western. We have spaceships instead of horses, zap guns instead of six-shooters, but it'll be familiar. And unfortunately, when they gave me the money and set of good actors and a director, I went ape. And they didn't get what they'd asked for or what they had agreed on, and they were naturally very upset.
Frustrated into a need to display physical prowess, the creature will throw himself against the transparency.
If you were in here, wouldn't you test the strength of these walls, too? There's a way out of any cage, and I'll find it.
I met with Gene. I was somewhat fascinated by him because he was so likable and so much more interested, it seemed, in finding out what I wanted to do with my life rather than what he needed for his show. I got tapped to be the first assistant on the first pilot because of what certain people had heard, including Herb Solo, who was vice president in charge of development at Desilu.
Spock here.
Landing party, come in.
There is no survivors encampment, number 1. This is all some sort of trap. We've lost the captain. Do you read?
Leonard was already cast when I came on to the first pilot. Oddly, or not oddly, but tellingly, he was not number 1. Number 1 was done by Majel Barrett. And I thought that was a real step forward in television history, to have a woman partially in command of a ship like this. I worked very, very hard on that first Star Trek pilot as the first assistant. The show went over schedule just as I had warned the people of Desilu that it would, no matter how much they cut the budget and the shooting schedule, we were still going to finish in the time it takes to shoot the show.
There were no sci-fi shows on. There was nothing even close to what Star Trek was. And
there have been the anthologies, Twilight Zone and so forth.
But that wasn't the same. That wasn't a series, and I didn't think it could be done.
I was concerned until I got a chance to read the script that it would be really difficult to land a spaceship on the surface of a planet every week. You know, the spaceship was very, very large, and the planet was was unknown, and so was our ability to afford to be able to do that. My problem was solved for me because Gene, in all his wisdom, came up with the idea of beam me up, you know, and that took care of having to land.
The meteorite beam is not deflected, Captain.
Evasive maneuver, sir.
Steady as we go.
The other problem was I was concerned that we'd have to float the actors on wires throughout the whole season because there's weightlessness in space. And very fortunately for us, Gene Roddenberry came up with another concept, which was artificial gravity, which was the last thing to go when all else failed and life systems were breaking down on the ship, and they were being battered by untold number of enemies. No matter what happened, people were still upright and walking around.
We did 2 pilots, and of course did a lot of thinking about it and drawing sketches just before then.
Somehow, a second pilot got broached, and I got a phone call from Gene Roddenberry saying, hey Bob, we're going to do another one, and I want you to be the associate producer this time.
I'd never heard of that happening before. It was a great break. I don't know how much Eldon Schwimmer, who was the agent from ICM, had to do with it. I don't know how much juice he had, how much power or pressure he put on. I don't know. I don't think it would have happened with Mission, which he put together just like he put Star Trek together with Paramount. I don't think that they would have gotten a second shot. But Star Trek did get a second shot. It was lucky.
Well, Gene had a capacity for making things happen the way he wanted them to.
When they decided to try again, everything was scaled back dramatically in terms of budgets, in terms of sets. Jeffrey Hunter couldn't be had. He was the captain and the original pilot, and he couldn't be had because they wanted him to, he wanted some movie commitments which they couldn't offer him, so he bowed out. Bill Shatner came on.
I heard from Gene that Bill Shatner had been hired to be our new captain. And I was thrilled because I had worked with Bill on The Outer Limits, and I found rapport with him.
Gravitation on automatic.
I was amazed with his energy and his endurance. He was something else. And I thought that he brings unique qualities to Star Trek that we haven't had before. Those were likability, energy, humanity, because he suffered for what he had to put his crew through, as any leader of men and women must do.
They recast the Doctor. Major Barrett, who had been the second in command of the ship, was given another role. She was cast as Nurse Chapel instead. The only character that remained intact in casting and concept was Spock, which was lucky for me.
I believe there's some hope for you after all, Mr. Spock.
Well, in the first pilot, Mr. Spock was not the unemotional, computer-like mind. He tended to smile and get upset like anyone else. One with the unemotional mind was our first officer, played by Major Barrett. And when they turned down that pilot and said, you can't have a woman second in command of a spaceship, and the women agreed. They kept writing, who does she think she is? We then built Mr. Spock's background, his Vulcan background, and he became the Mr. Spock you know now.
We went ahead to do it again under a very strict budgetary control, and the budget was a killer. The studio was very anxious to get the show on the air and made it very inexpensive for the network, because the network simply wasn't sold on it and wasn't ready to pay a big price for it. And that was a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The network had an attitude that was, make it cheap because we don't believe in it, and they never did believe in it. Even when it was working, they didn't believe it. They didn't get it either.
I hoped it wouldn't get sold to a network because I didn't know whether we could make it. The problems inherent in that show and its sister show, Mission Impossible, which Herb Solow also sold at the same time, they were so difficult that I really had fears that we could never make the schedule and, quote, meet our air dates, unquote.
Well, they gave us less money than for the first, but we had our stages built. And over the years, I've said some nasty things about networks, and they deserve nasty things. But I think we should also remember a couple of the vice presidents saw something there that never saw or never felt. They felt that they were in the future, we're in a spaceship, and they said, let's do the never before done and give Roddenberry some more money. On the promise that I make it something recognizable this time.
Behold.
Sally Kellerman could take those silver orbs and slip them in her eyeballs and slip them out with no problem whatsoever. It is as if they didn't exist. Whereas our other guest star, Gary Lockwood, had great trouble using them, and to see through those little pinholes that we had in him, he'd tilt his head back and kind of look down his nose at whoever he was talking to. Well, it was a weird look and kind of worked for us in a way. It gave him kind of an importance, or almost beyond the role itself. It was a strange sight to see.
Can you hear me, James? You cannot see me, I'm not there.
I found out in talking with Gene early on that he had based the character of Captain Kirk on two fictional characters, one of whom was Hamlet, who doubted his ability to make happen what he needed, what he knew he had to make happen, and the other was Captain Horatio Hornblower, who suffered for the suffering of the people under his command. And with those two as a background, I understood completely who Captain Kirk was.
I wish I were on a long sea voyage somewhere. Not too much deck tennis, no frantic dancing, and no responsibility. Why me? I look around that bridge, and I see the men waiting for me to make the next move. And Bones, what if I'm wrong?
For a while, it was Buck Rogers. Ray Bradbury and I were about the same age, and we both sat on our front porch and waited for the newspaper to be delivered with Buck Rogers in. I think Flash Gordon in the comic strips, I particularly loved the, for those days, semi-nude women. They were so gorgeous, wow. And, but my greatest fan experience has been since growing up. The Hornblower series, C.S. Forster's Sea Stories, and that very much affected me on Star Trek. I wanted to make Captain Kirk sort of a hornblower living out there. Hornblower was in the days of when a sailing ship off the coast of Africa was out of touch with a home port. The captain was required to be part diplomat, part humanist, many things.
Your move, Captain.
We should have intercepted by now. The bridge said they'd call.
I'll have you checkmated your next move.
Have I ever mentioned you play a very irritating game of chess, Mr. Spock?
Irritating? Ah, yes. One of your Earth emotions.
Certain you don't know what irritation is?
The pointed ears was immediately introduced as an idea. There were other ideas that fell by the wayside. Gene originally thought that the character should be made up in red. His skin should be red. There was still a lot of black and white TV sets out there, and when we tried wearing red makeup, it just went black, which was not what he had in mind. So that went away.
He looked a little different, and so did I. Here's a picture of the two of us about the time that we were testing his ears and trying to decide what they would really look like, what they should look like. We tried many shapes and sizes.
Then we began dealing with the idea that Spock had a copper-based blood, and that would produce a green effect. So we found a sort of a yellowish, greenish tinge to the makeup that was not quite the ruddy flesh and blood look that humans had. Freddie Phillips, who was the makeup man of the show, brilliant guy, and I spent days sitting in front of the mirror working on the eyebrows and working on the ears and working on the haircut. And the ears were difficult. It finally seemed easy, but it was difficult again because of budget problems. The studio had hired a local company to do special effects prosthetics, meaning that they would create heads and hands and feet and bodysuits for alien monster types of creatures. And in that contract that they were being paid for, they also had agreed to do my ears. They could do the rough stuff. They could do big, hairy hands, and they could do grotesque heads and so forth. But they were not used to doing the fine appliance work that you need to do when you're putting stuff on a human's face to make it look like it's really part of him. So the first ears that came down were kind of rough and grotesque. And Freddie put them on me, and he knew that this was not right. And we agreed, so we went back and tried them again. And they tried to refine it, but they didn't have the technique or the know-how to do it. So he went to the studio and explained that. And they said, well, we're paying them, so you just keep working them until they get it right. And we tried and tried and tried, and shooting date is approaching. And we don't have ears that work. And one day, it wasn't more than 3 days before we were supposed to start shooting, Freddie put on the final pair that had come from them and looked in the mirror, and he reached up and grabbed the tips of them and ripped them off of me and threw them in the wastebasket. And he went to the phone, and he called a guy at MGM makeup department, a guy named Charlie Schramm, who ran the makeup department there. And he said, Charlie, I'm on a spot. I got an actor here. I have to have a pair of kind of Mephistopheles devilish ears on the guy, and I need him now. Can you help me? And he got off the phone. He said, come on with me. We got in Freddie's car, drove over to MGM. I laid down at the table. Charlie Schramm applied the plaster to my ears to make a mold. And on the morning that we started shooting, 2 days later, the ears arrived, and Freddie put them on, and he was smiling. And we had the ears that worked. So Freddie Phillips saved my life as far as the character was concerned. He took it on himself to defy the studio. There was $600 involved. $600 is what it cost to get the ear done right, and they didn't want to pay it. And he took it on himself. He said, I don't care, I'll pay it myself. I'm not going to put you on camera with those other people's ears. And that's how we solved the ear problem.
Ship to ship.
Hailing frequencies open, sir.
Just before the show began, he changed the communications officer from a male to female and brought me back from Europe to become Uhura, which had not been named until I got the role. And when they saw who he had hired, because he told the suits that he was going to make a little change on the ship, and he wanted to add a little color to it. They thought yes, because they thought the costumes were a little drab. So my first costume actually was a drab green. And when they saw not only that I was the new communications officer, but this part was much larger than yes sir, no sir, they said it can't happen. And Gene said, she stays or I go. He fought for it, he battled bitterly for it, and he won out in the end.
Sir, contact with an object. It's moving toward us. No visual contact yet.
Deflector is full density.
It's coming at light speed.
Collision course.
Evasive maneuvers, Mr. Sulu.
When I met Gene Roddenberry and he told me about the idea of the show and the kind of character that I was being considered for, I desperately wanted to get this part. First of all, the idea of Star Trek, the vision that Gene had. He said that the Starship Enterprise was a metaphor for Starship Earth, and the strength of the starship lay in its diversity, but that diversity working together in concert. And that's why I was being considered. I was to represent the Asian portion of the great diversity of this starship.
Astrocytes is standing by, Captain. Engineering station ready, as always.
I've been able to do accents ever since I can remember. And fortunately, I have a very good ear for it. A lot of concentration has to go into that sort of thing. And like Scotty, there was a fellow in a signals camp during the war. It was from Aberdeen, and I based my Scottish accent on him because he was the one. He was with us for 6 weeks. And the first week, I couldn't understand a word he said.
How's it going, Scotty?
Well, sir, it's a plumber's nightmare, but it'll hold for a bit.
It has to hold longer than a bit.
I'm sorry, sir, that's about the best I can do, and I guarantee it's not good enough.
Gene Roddenberry asked me which accent I liked, and I said, well, if you want an engineer, I think he better be a Scotsman, because they're the best engineers that I have ever heard about.
Where is he?
I don't know, Jim. This is a big ship. I'm just a country doctor.
DeForest Kelley was an extremely generous man. He was a gentleman in all senses of the word. And I think he was very generous in his time and in his work. But he was always so easy to work with. He had been a friend of Gene Roddenberry's for a long time. He had been in the police story pilot that we did in the summer of 1965. He was not in the first two Star Trek pilots. There were other doctors, and they kind of moved aside, either for other commitments or because Gene felt after seeing them, well, the guy's a little too old. I want somebody who's a little closer to Kirk's age, not contemporary. He wasn't. He was about 10 years older than Kirk and Spock, but he had a little more wisdom and a little more time in living. And so he brought that humanity to the triumvirate. Whereas Kirk was the action guy and Spock was the brain guy, the logic guy. McCoy was the human guy. And with the three of them, it made a wonderful human being, actually.
There was such a feeling of, oh, what a joy, what a kick. It was so well written. They were writing things, and I could use the pronoun we. We're writing things that hadn't been done on television before. There was such a wonderful relationship of the characters, as well as in many cases between the actors and the crew and the camera people. That usually happens on a shoot, but here we were for 3 years together. Most of us stayed the same. The directors were the same for the most part, and there was a continuity. And there was a sharing of experience. Things in real life happened. There were deaths and births. And so the sharing with human beings is right there, as well as the real joy of well-written scenes that you never get in television as a rule. And so the good stories, the fun action, and the wonderful human beings that I was associated with remain in my memory.
Mr. Sulu, proceed on course to Marcus 3. Ahead, warp factor 1.
Aye, sir.